So throughout this series, we're going to be delving into the past, the present, and the future of the relationship between religion and space exploration. And today, we focus on the past by asking the question, how has religion shaped space exploration? Now, most people know that the various bodies in the solar system, as well as NASA missions, tend to be named after Greek gods and goddesses. But fewer people know, for example, that the crew of the Apollo 8 mission, the first crewed mission to leave Earth's orbit, read from the biblical book of Genesis as they orbited the moon. So, in fact, the conversations between religion and space exploration started long before we ever sent humans into space. And to help us explore that question, we've invited two expert historians.
And it is my joy to introduce our two expert historians this evening. First, Roger Launius is former chief historian at NASA and author of numerous books on the history of space travel. These include, very recently, this beautiful volume called The Smithsonian History of Space Exploration from the Ancient World to the Extraterrestrial Future, and also Apollo's Legacy, The Space Race in Perspective. Victoria Smolkin is Associate Professor of History and Russian and East European Studies at Wesleyan University, and also author of A Sacred Space is Never Empty, A History of Soviet Atheism. Her current book project is called The Wall of Memory, Ukraine and Its Histories. You can find out more about both of these speakers on our website, and I can throw the link in the chat in a moment so that you can head back there to read more details and to look them up. Speaking of the chat, it's wonderful to see people checking in and letting us know where you're from. Great to see you. Please feel free to use the chat during the webinar to engage in respectful exchange with one another, to offer any sources that may be coming to mind. We will be checking the chat for kindness and common decency, but we won't be checking it for questions. The questions will go in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you go there now, you see there are two little like comic book boxes. The Q&A thing, click there. You'll be able to submit your question there. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar. We will start looking at them toward the end of our time together. So here's a word about the order of things. This is how it'll go. Lance and I will be talking with Doctors Launius and Smolkin in a fairly casual way until about 7:50. This is precise. This is 7:50, at which point we're going to turn to the questions that you've submitted through the Q&A. Our panelists will address those questions. We'll be feeding them to them. We'll be talking with them for about 20 minutes in relation to your questions, and we will be sure to wrap up at 8:15 Eastern Standard Time, because we know that you've got other things to do, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you again at the next installment.
Great. Thank you, MJ. So I want to address Roger and Victoria here. So love to hear an opening response from both of you. Sort of just what comes to mind when you hear this question: how has religion influenced space exploration? Victoria, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to start. I mean, I think it's such a huge question, and I would begin by shifting the attention to considering not just the how of you do this, of why we are interested in space and why we want to explore it and maybe even inhabit it, but the why. And part of I think the trouble with thinking about religion in this context is that there's been this oppositional relationship between science and religion that really has marked much of the conversation certainly for the 20th century. And I think we're beginning to kind of transcend that dichotomy now. Both religion and space exploration are really oriented toward the future, and more specifically, I think, toward the project of human salvation in some form. And space, of course, is the great unknown. So you have to imagine its meaning. Of course, the more we know about it, right, the more we can fill it with concrete material knowledge, but at the same time, you continue to come up with narratives and myths. And I think, you mentioned that we name our space missions after myths and religious, and I think that's why, right? That these are the narratives we have for making sense, for making it accessible to us. But I think in the context of space exploration, in a way, a lot of that energy has moved into science fiction. Right? So it kind of lives in a different sphere, and space exploration has in a way become largely, or has been for some time, a kind of engineering enterprise, right? It's a bit about science and technology, and has removed some of that energy, some of that sacred kind of conversation elsewhere. So I think that this conversation is terrific because it allows us to begin to re-enter or kind of reconnect some of these threads that have kind of been separated over time historically. And certainly in the Soviet case, which I'm happy to talk about later, this project, the revolutionary project, was a project that was fundamentally connected with a kind of planetary understanding of historical change. And, it was a radical rupture, an end to one world, the beginning of another. And even the representations of it were depicted as a kind of planetary landscape where the people were making a new world. So I think that these motifs very much show up, and eventually, and I think we can talk about this more later, but eventually that project, that kind of sacred project, that utopian project, becomes above all a project about modernization. And again, that sacred kind of utopian energy is removed from it or becomes separate from it, but I think it was there from the beginning, and we can talk about the ways in which at various critical moments in the Russian-Soviet case, it really came in to inject a kind of fuel and propel the project to a new stage of development.
Great, thank you, Roger.
Sure, I'd like to play off of a few things that Victoria raised, and she's absolutely right about the why question in terms of space exploration. And it gets to some sort of metaphysical aspects of our existence and things that we are deeply concerned about. Religion is a part of life for almost everybody in the world in some form or another. They may not call it that per se. It may be more philosophy or spirituality or a way of life, but it fundamentally gets to some of these larger questions. And the why on spaceflight is I think first and foremost about the issue of salvation, not for the individual. And of course, all religion is built around the idea of personal salvation in some form or another. But it's about salvation of the human race. So moving off this planet, going to other places, colonizing those other places, establishing a human presence throughout the cosmos is about that, I believe, fundamental issue of not becoming extinct. Because the reality is we will become extinct. It's 100% certainty remaining on this planet for the indefinite future. And so that has sparked a lot of thinking inside the space community, because you have to fundamentally ask the question, why are we doing these things? The astronauts can go up into space, they can operate on the International Space Station. We can undertake camping trips as we did during Apollo when we went and landed on the moon, took everything with us we needed, stayed there for a few days and came back. That's a camping trip. And that's always viewed as something that was cool, important, and needs to be sustained. But in the context of going someplace permanently, establishing settlements there, having families that are, and people who are born, raised, and die there, that's a whole different environment. And it fundamentally is about getting off this planet to go throughout the cosmos. Religion has been at the root of all of the things associated with spaceflight, and when I say that, not just this business of human migration, but also the practice of religion and whatever form that a person accepts it. So we've had these repeated instances of expressions of faith, of rituals that have taken place in space, of individuals who have conducted various sacred activities on space flights as a part of their reverence for their belief system. We've also seen this sort of created process of ritualization in the various space programs that take on a connotation of almost religiosity. NASA does this, the astronauts do this, the cosmonauts do various aspects of this as well. So we could go on and on with what this might mean, but let me just back off to one particular area, and that is the fundamental aspect of the survival of humanity moving beyond this planet.
Great. Thank you so much, both. Victoria, let's go to you for a moment. So you're a Soviet historian. One might, among other things, one might be forgiven for wondering why we invited you here today. We're talking about religion and space exploration, and one might think that in a Soviet context, religion has absolutely nothing to do with space exploration. After all, weren't they atheists? Wasn't the project an avowedly atheist project? Could you sketch in a little bit of the sort of the Soviet worldview for us, maybe explaining a little bit about this philosophy of cosmism that takes hold? What is it, and how can we think about it in relation to what we usually think of as religion?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's completely understandable why one might wonder what Soviet atheism has to do with religion in space, since its pronouncements were decidedly anti-religious, and I'll fill that out a little bit later. But of course, one would be wrong to assume that this is a kind of a side story. And in fact, I think maybe kind of working off of Roger's comments about salvation and about extinction, the tradition of Russian cosmism was fundamentally engaged with a version of this. And this tradition began at the turn of the 20th century, kind of late 19th, early 20th century. And this was the first kind of systematic articulation for why we need to go to space. And the reason was that actually the goal, right, going to space was in a way a means to a different end. And that end was actually finding living space for our resurrected ancestors. So
resurrected ancestors, you say?
Yes, that's right.
That's
right. That's right. Like, let me back up a little bit. So Russian cosmism is this. It's been in some ways lost to history, although of course not in that part of the world. But it was a philosophical proposition that combined science and religion and saw the colonization of outer space as an essential, but in a way kind of secondary project to a more urgent and more morally grounded concern, which was the resurrection of the dead. And that was conceived as a debt that the living had to pay to their ancestors, right, to figure out how to overcome death. And in some ways, that's the final frontier of science, right? In some ways, this is what we're still chasing after. So this idea there was a conviction that this was scientifically possible, not kind of metaphorically, not philosophically, but materially, which of course then raises the question of living space, which is connected, right, to the questions that we're facing now for, how are we all going to inhabit this limited planet? But back then the idea is, okay, if we're going to resurrect all these people, and live an immortal life collectively, then we need to expand humanity beyond the confines of the earth. And so there's so this is kind of the point of origin, and the thinker who really embodied this and was the founder of cosmism saw this as humanity's great task. This was the kind of fundamental reason for our existence, is to overcome death and thereby kind of pay a debt to those who came before us and brought us to our stage of development. So this project was taken up by a figure named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. And Tsiolkovsky was a provincial librarian, a kind of amateur rocket scientist, a fascinating figure. Highly recommend everyone look into his biography. But he became, in a way, the grandfather. He's known as the grandfather of the Soviet space project, the actual Soviet space project that we know here as a kind of Cold War enterprise, scientific and technological enterprise. And Tsiolkovsky, was influenced by Fyodorov. He was an acolyte, but really much more kind of technologically engaged and scientifically engaged. And he in turn inspired Sergei Korolev, who is known as the father of the Soviet space program. So you have this situation that, this kind of almost paradigmatic symbol of Cold War science and technology and the military industrial complex, right, in a way, has these almost mystical, in part, these mystical origins that go back to some of the fundamental questions that are at the center of many religions and belief systems and ideologies. And in a way that becomes the thing, the energy that kind of propels the technological project. And of course, without the state investment, without all the Cold War kind of context, there's so many other layers that needed to happen in order for that to actually materialize into something that allowed humankind to leave the confines of this planet. But I think at its origin, that was the project. And my work on Soviet atheism in a way shows the reinfusion of some of that utopian rhetoric back into the project at key points, to do a certain kind of political work and ideological work for the Soviet system and for the Soviet narrative, but also because it mattered to people. Because this was a narrative that people were fundamentally curious about, wanted to know more about. Cosmonauts were incredibly popular, beloved, and I can speak more to the specific role that I think they played in Soviet society. But I think, we often forget those origins, right? So and we start the story with Korolev and kind of move forward.
Well, but to move forward a little bit, though, so that there's the kind of positive world building aspect of cosmism as a sort of extension of Soviet atheism, and then there's the negative side. I think about when Yuri Gagarin got back from his first space flight in 1961. It becomes really important for Khrushchev to circulate the idea that when Gagarin was up there, he didn't see any God there. He didn't see any angels. He didn't see anything. So that's more like the negative project, right? And why was that so important? Why was it important for him why did that story become so mythic?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a interesting kind of series of events that lead to that becoming a narrative that is circulated, because of course initially the space project and even Gagarin's trip were not about this at all. Like, this was not the kind of primary. They didn't send him there to look for God, right?
To go find God, right?
So then the question becomes, why then, upon his return, does this become part of the narrative? And I think in general, the Soviet, the kind of the party apparatus was generally actually surprised by the real ideological and cultural capital that their achievements in space, especially human space flight, had induced. I think they didn't anticipate the level of kind of fervent devotion and enthusiasm that it would provoke in people. And this is at the peak of the Cold War, and the question that that they had to grapple with was one of which form of modernization ultimately was the one that would defeat the other. And this became a project, a narrative in which atheism served to prove that, in fact, it was absolutely essential for humanity to break ties with religion in order to be able to make this leap Now, this could only exist, this narrative could exist for a very short period of time, basically, until the Americans went to space. But there was this idea that, of course we were first, right? Because we're materialists, because we are able to, we are not chained down by these belief systems. We are fully empowered. We are fully emancipated, right? That is what communism offers to humanity. And therefore, we know for certain, right? We have that kind of confidence, we have that clarity that that the world is material and that it's magical in its own right, and we don't need, religion to explain anything, right? So in a way, it's this effort to tie modernity to materialism and atheism, and thereby show that the Americans on their end are still kind of living in this archaic, worldview that that ultimately means that they're destined to extinction, basically.
Great. This is the perfect transition for me to ask Roger. So in the introduction earlier, I talked about how the Apollo 8 astronauts, when they were orbiting the moon, they read from the biblical book of Genesis. Can you talk about the place of that event and other events like the taking of communion right before stepping onto the lunar surface, and other similar episodes, in terms not only of its like why did that happen, why those events, but also in the conversation between the U.S. space program and the Soviet.
Well, sure. Statements of faith, reading from the first couple of verses in the book of Genesis, and wishing Christmas greetings to the people of the good earth. And they made a very big point that this is not just Americans or just Christians or any other group in this context, but all of the people of the earth, was a decision on the part of the crew to do this. It was not something that was necessarily planned out by NASA, although NASA certainly didn't object to it, the leaders of the agency. And those leaders were, while some were practicing of their religion and very faithful in that context, others were not so much so, but all of them were friendly toward this effort. And so we see this going back to the very earliest days of the astronauts, especially. And Victoria made the point that the cosmonauts became these heroes to the Soviet people, and literally around the world in this sense. I mean, it wasn't just limited to the Soviet Union. The American astronauts performed the same purpose, and routinely, in fact, when they unveiled the Mercury 7 astronauts in 1959, one of the first questions that was asked of them in the press conference was, are you believing in any form of religion? Do you practice religion? And some of them did and were quite diligent in doing so, and some of them not so much. But all of them said, I have these sets of beliefs, and they never tried to minimize that. And that became the thing that was picked up on by the media immediately to sort of characterize them in a particular way, that they were they were essentially our representatives going into space, and they are the best that we have moving forward as a society, and that includes the context of religion. And we've seen it demonstrated over and over again in space activities. You mentioned specifically Buzz Aldrin taking communion on the moon before he set out from Apollo 11. Other astronauts have also engaged in similar sorts of activities.
Roger, do you think that was it a direct response to the Soviet no God here? Do you know, or
no,
do you not
I don't believe it was a direct response. I think it was something. It was important to the crew of Apollo 8 that they do something like this. And they were representative of a community of faith at some level. So, but it wasn't a direct result. And of course, a number of years had passed between those early statements by the Soviet premier and what was taking place in 1968.
But there is certainly a tying in, right, of American identity to a certain kind of, if we can use the term, like Judeo-Christian identity, right? I mean, it wasn't the Constitution that they read. It wasn't, I don't know, Robert Frost. It wasn't a number of things, right?
That's absolutely correct. But they were representative also of what some people referred to as sort of American civil religion.
Right.
And they certainly embraced those concepts. And so issues of patriotism and Judeo-Christian tradition all get sort of wrapped up into this and are expressed in a variety of ways in the American program.
So I wonder if we can follow this train a little bit to more recent history. In 2020, as I'm sure you know, Donald Trump announced that the U.S. was going, this was before the Artemis mission was really, it was just in advance of the announcement of the Artemis mission. The U.S. was going to go back to the moon and then was going to go to Mars from the moon because he said, outer space is America's manifest destiny. He used this language. What do you think he was trying to do by using this language? What is that? What historical work is it doing to call outer space America's manifest destiny?
Well, that harkens back to a whole series of earlier concepts as well, also a part of the space program, to the very beginning of it, where you've got John Kennedy announcing that it is the new frontier. It gets translated in Star Trek into the final frontier, but it sort of raises the same sorts of connotations in the context of American westward expansion and the sense that these individuals are going to gain suzerainty over this arena, and it's going to be somehow better than what had been before. There's a utopianism that's a part of it. There's all kinds of elements to it that sort of conjure up these happy metaphors of the past, which, by the way, are not really all that happy, but nonetheless were accepted, and still remain to be accepted in many places of our society and the frontier. And manifest destiny from the 19th century was a term that basically said Americans were destined to take over this continental United States. And this was the way God intended it. And there's art, there's literature, there's all kinds of other aspects of this that sort of shows that particular mindset. Space is exactly in the same category. And so it's used, and when talking about it, these sorts of earlier concepts get used. Trump was not the first person to make this particular comment. John Glenn wrote an article in 1983, which basically used the term manifest destiny in the context of space exploration as well. And I'm not sure that exactly what Trump meant by this, but his speechwriter was clearly thinking in the context of those earlier ideas about American movement and populations and taking over territories.
And it wasn't just American movement. The implicit in this my understanding of it is that it is a divine kind of blessing of the future of a nation and
Right.
its place in the world. It's and beyond the world, in fact.
Well, I mean, this gets back, there's a whole series of sort of myths in American history, and one of them is sort of this sense that Americans are a new chosen people. Not to use a term that has lots of biblical connotations, but that we are somehow ordained to do certain kinds of things, and that this is better and intended to be the future of this planet, and of course the American people leading it. But in that context, it's really significant to think about it as an issue that has motivated us from the very beginning is very much a part of space flight right up to the present. And we will not see it change, I don't think, anytime in the near future.
So I want to shift back to Victoria. Roger talked about this idea of the manifest destiny, this divine blessing, this notion of the U.S. as God's chosen people. It strikes me that that description mirrors, like, remarkably the self-conception of the Russian Soviet people, in a sense that goes back long before the emergence of the Soviet Union. The notion that Russia has some important destiny in the world, something important to teach the world. And regardless of this movement towards atheism under the Soviet Union, that mystical strain is never far from the surface. Can you talk a little bit about the way things have changed since we didn't find God in space, with the fall of the Soviet Union? Of course, when that happened, all of these old repressed cosmism texts began to be published again. So talk about the new kind of myth that's guiding the Russian space program, distinguishing it from the Soviet era and maybe comparing it to what's going on in the US. That's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you're kind of, I think you're asking several different things, and they are connected, but not necessarily kind of directly and causally, if that makes sense. I mean, certainly there is, I think, Russia in both its imperial, in its Muscovite, in its imperial, in its Soviet forms, and now in the new kind of conception of the Russian world, so to speak, has engaged in a kind of messianic project, right? It's believed itself to do exactly what you're saying, which is, be the vehicle through which humanity would be saved and redeemed. And so I definitely think that tradition is there. And even at the time, even in the 19th century, there was a sense, right, that the US is going west and Russia goes east, and they're both kind of moving into these kind of large empty spaces to civilize them, to save them, to kind of fortify their own project. So I think that kind of is underneath that mystical kind of messianic strand is both connected to and independent from the cosmism, right? That kind of overlays it. I think we didn't kind of dwell on a really key point, I think, that I have to mention in order to make the post-Soviet period make sense, which is that, in a way, the space enthusiasm of the late 50s, 60s, really that kind of decade between Sputnik and the Americans landing on the moon, it was connected very much. It was doing really important historical work in a period of Soviet history when the entire project was in some ways in question as a result of Stalin's death, as a result of the revelations about the cost of modernization in the Soviet Union, and about the tremendous kind of trauma, human casualties, and how to justify these crimes, right? These violent repressions, the sacrifices of resources, and so on. So in a way, the space program became, in the Khrushchev era, as it tried to reckon with the human cost of Soviet modernization, I think it gave the project a kind of second life. It became a vehicle of redemption. It kind of, in a way, functioned as a way to redeem the costs of Soviet modernization, to say, well, it wasn't all for nothing, right? Or it wasn't all just to build factories, right? There is something greater than tanks that we've achieved through our great sacrifice, through putting our people through this, tremendously painful and costly process. And so cosmonauts, I think they weren't just heroes and celebrities. They were really vehicles, I think, of collective redemption, right? They were the reason that the rest of it was kind of could make sense, right? Because we've now pushed humankind into a new era of history, of development, and that takes sacrifice. So in a way, they're doing really key work that then redeemed a project that was really morally fraught in that moment, especially after Stalin's death. So in terms of what happens after, what are the myths that are guiding the post-Soviet period, I think what's really interesting is it really is the Soviet myth that is guiding the post-Soviet period. There's no kind of coherent, systematic, ideological, spiritual program attached to the Russian space program. It's this kind of, eclectic combination of this reverence and, worship of the Soviet past and Soviet greatness, and the loss of this, and then a kind of a lament of this utopian drive, the loss of the utopian drive. And at the same time, kind of infusing it now with all sorts of strange rituals, which, we Roger talked a little about this on the Russian side, blessing the spaceships before they take off by priests, and the icons now being inside the ISS, all of this stuff that in a way is completely at odds with the materialist kind of ideological project. So this is in a way, I think that the very essence of post-Soviet Russia up until fairly recently is that it doesn't try to create coherent narratives. It really it takes these eclectic elements, puts them together, and it's like whatever can infuse this with energy, right, with drive, is going to be used. And I think the most visible thing for me when I was doing my research on this was these memes that came out that I think they emerged about 5 years ago, right around the time of the centennial of the revolution, actually. And they were memes that said, "Forgive us, Yuri, we've messed it all up." And I don't know, Roger, if you saw these, but they were, this was a whole genre that was, in a way, the promise of that moment of Yuri Gagarin and achievement and first person in space, and then, a sequential kind of decline into the final square being something obscene, like a priest, blessing a spaceship or something, some other sign of decline and degeneration in post-Soviet life. And so in a way, that's the myth. The myth is the Yuri myth, right? Is Yuri as this kind of moment when there was moral clarity, there was faith, enthusiasm, and optimism, and now we had this historical moment, opportunity, and we've somehow squandered it. And that and so that's been the kind of aftermath.
And so what we need to do, if you're a Russian, is make Russia great again.
If only it were that kind of straightforward. So Dmitry Rogozin, for example, right, who is the former director of Roscosmos, the space agency, the Russian space agency, is currently on the front lines in Donbass. I mean, so these things, the kind of, yes, he just did an interview about, this kind of make Russia great again. But at the same time, it's completely incoherent in a kind of theological, ideological sense. It's really, this hodgepodge of kind of anti-Westernism and resentment, but they're talking about him becoming a political figure. I even saw something about him being the new kind of ambassador or governor of this new kind of Crimean region that was annexed. Right? So I mean, it's all, I guess I'm kind of all over the place because the narrative is all over the place, right? It isn't just make Russia great again. It's this kind of show everyone else that they're terrible and we're right, right? It's kind of unlike, make America great again. This is really, it needs the recognition of the other in order to matter, right? It's a conversation with the West, with these kind of external entities that have to reflect back that actually, no, you are, this is actually a greatness and that we all have to recognize and grapple with and reckon with.
Thank you so much, Roger. To give us a sense of so Victoria's been talking about the complexity, the eclectic kind of mashup of all of these different themes that are informing at this point Russian space exploration. I wonder if we can get at some of the complexity, the sort of mythological complexity between the U.S. side as well, or on the U.S. side as well. You are, as folks may or may not know, trained as among other things, a scholar of Mormon history and the Mormon religion. I mean, the playwright Tony Kushner says that Mormonism is the American religion. I mean, it's the one that America produces, right? It's the and which is why he bases
one
his
among
angels
many, I might add.
What do you say?
One among many that was produced in America.
Yes, well, I mean, for him, it's the pinnacle of it, because of the different themes that it combines. And I wonder, because among other things, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but Mormonism has a robust cosmology that informs its theology and stems from its theology. Are there ways that the sort of Mormon character of the U.S. has informed the space program in the U.S. or has informed any of our imagination about what's possible out there, or what it is, what our job is out there? What's the relationship between Mormonism and this?
Yeah, I mean, there's some very specific things. So I wrote an article a number of years ago on James Fletcher, who was the NASA administrator in the early 1970s, and then again just after the Challenger accident in the 80s. And he was a believing Latter-day Saint, and so I wanted to asked the question. And now he comes out of a science and technology background, so he's PhD, he's trained, all that sort of thing. Is there something about his beliefs associated with Mormonism that may have affected how he went about his duties? And there were some of them that I thought were that did inform those. One of those was in the Mormon Book of Abraham. There's a discussion of plurality of worlds, of multiple worlds in which there are entities that live there, human beings, if you will. So Mormon cosmology tells you that they are out there somewhere. Extraterrestrials are there. In his particular case, that did arise in the context of the search for extraterrestrial life and putting money into those kinds of activities. Can we definitively determine whether or not there's life beyond this planet? We have not done so, but many people believe that there is, and no doubt, probably a lot of the viewers today believe that as well. And so, can we take some action that might lead us down the path of determining that on a scientific basis? And we've not succeeded in that yet. But Fletcher put money in that, and that's been an ongoing activity at NASA for a long time. And at some level, it was present before, but in the 1970s, it was ramped up significantly as well. And he talked about this in speeches and how important this was to try to determine these sorts of things from the standpoint of science. Mormonism also teaches, lots of other religions do this as well, that we are stewards over the earth, and that we must try to take care of it. And in that context, Fletcher emphasized the rise of what we now refer to as Earth system science, and NASA's role in pursuing that. On his watch, the first Landsat satellites were launched in the early 1970s, which were enormously significant in the context of mapping this particular planet over time and showing the changes that's taking place to vegetation, to sea level, to a variety of other things associated with the planet. And that's a part of our stewardship activities, to be perfectly honest. There's other things that have followed since that time that he wasn't associated with, but that was an important early step. So there are those things that we can point to. He certainly embraced the idea of the expression of faith on the part of astronauts or other individuals associated with NASA and spaceflight. And made available opportunities for them to participate in those kinds of activities. That's not to say any other NASA administrator would have condemned them. Nobody certainly has, but in Fletcher's case, he emphasized them as well.
Well, on those rituals, I wonder, Lance, if you want to talk about those rituals, kinds of rituals.
Well, actually, I wonder if you could talk, about what are the rituals happening today in both the Russian space program and the U.S. space program. You sort of alluded to them earlier. What kinds of rituals are being practiced among the people who go to space?
I can say something about that. NASA's been very open for the expression of religion in space, and especially in the context of extended missions like on the International Space Station, or before that, the joint missions with the Russians in the context of the Mir program in the 1990s. Where you've got astronauts who are not up there for just a few days, but are up there for, in some cases, months. And they are allowed to participate in whatever rituals they think are appropriate within certain bounds, obviously. They're not going to let you burn incense on the space station or anything like that. But if you feel the need to pray on a regular basis, they try to make accommodations for that. If there are other types of rituals that will not do any damage to the sort of things that are taking place there, in terms of the other people who are working, they'll certainly allow you to do that. Jewish astronauts have observed Yom Kippur and other high holy days during their flights. Muslim astronauts who have flown have been allowed to pray, and that's created some interesting challenges. How do you pray toward Mecca when you're constantly moving? It's a problem not without difficulties. So making allowances for how you try to deal with that is something that has been the case all along. And I would suspect that the Russians have done the exact same thing on the space stations that they've been associated with. And of course, in the context of a joint program with the International Space Station, we have astronauts and cosmonauts who are of many different faiths, or no faiths at all in some cases, who engage in whatever belief system that they wish.
I'd love to hear, Victoria, you respond to this about rituals in the current Russian space program. You alluded earlier to priest blessing the rockets. It seems of a different character than what Roger was describing, of individual astronauts practicing whatever they want to practice. Can you unpack that? You're muted.
Yeah, that was inevitable. It was going to happen at least once. What I was actually going to say I only had a little bit to add to Roger's, comprehensive answer, and certainly he's, I think, far more knowledgeable than I on what astronauts and and spacefaring people are doing in space today. But I think from the Russian side, the only thing I would add is precisely that there's a public ritual aspect to it that is very much kind of politically engaged and part of a certain political narrative about Russia and its identity in the its contemporary identity as an Orthodox, as a state that privileges orthodoxy, that's very kind of open and promoting of Russian Orthodoxy as something that accompanies most state rituals and most state affairs. So, so what you see besides, I think they're much less interested in, freedom of. Here's where the kind of American tradition and the Russian tradition, I think, are showing their distinctiveness, because I don't think that they're particularly interested in what the cosmonauts do in terms of praying or not praying. And I have no idea what, if they do or not. But they certainly bring icons with them, right? And as a kind of cultural marker and a religious one. And, there's much more of an investment in the kind of what's going on Earth before they leave, right, before the ships take off, and about, the kind of sanctioning and connecting of the project, the space project, to the political project on Earth itself, right? So by way of using the Russian Orthodox Church to, in a way, sanction, bless, propel, wish them, safe return, as in a way almost a stand-in and for the state. So so I would say that there is a distinction, and that they're more interested in that public piece of it, and the kind of visible, like what occupies public space, what rituals are taking place in public life, less, what do they believe, what are they doing in terms of, observing their faith.
So amazingly, we are at our question and answer period. I've just written in the chat, and if a reminder that if you'd like to submit a question, please do write it in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. We've got some coming in. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can, but it's also really helpful just to see what you're thinking, so we can hold it in mind for future conversations. Maybe we can start with a question from Stuart Shupak, who asks, there's been a significant secularization of American society since 1968. Do you think the next generation of astronauts will display their religion, if they even are religious, as was done during the Apollo program? And I wonder here if we can talk about, so I guess maybe Roger will turn this to you initially, because we might also be able to talk about the kinds of rituals around space exploration that aren't necessarily tied to a particular religious tradition. But for example, if you were to ask an astronaut, like, hey, next time, can we just count down from 12 instead, or like 13 or 14, right? There are ways that these things have to be done. They have to be done totally scrupulously. Can you talk a little bit about the perceived secularization of U.S. society and how this might influence?
Yeah, I'm not a scholar of religions, but I'm not at all certain that society, American society, has become atheistic or anything approaching that. There's still a lot of public activities of reverence of various types, and we see it in all kinds of public settings as well as private settings. But the issues of the kinds of rituals that take place, they've grown up over time, and they're sort of like good luck charms. And so, there's always a pre-launch meal of a particular type of food that's been in place for a long, long time. And by the way, if you don't do that, that's really bad. And so there's a nostalgia for the past that sort of gets transitioned into the present, and obviously we'll move forward into the future. There are expressions of epiphany almost and not necessarily religious in the same sense, but I would contend it's religion adjacent. And that is something that virtually every astronaut has talked about, the view from Earth or from space of the Earth and what it has done to change their perspectives. And there are many statements of that particular issue. It's been expressed by virtually everybody in their autobiographies. It's talked about routinely when astronauts speak in public about how it changes your perspective when you see the fact that there are no lines between countries in space, and that you're looking on this beautiful world in which there are these billions of people, and so we all are living on a little boat ourselves, and we better do things to try to preserve this particular planet. And that's an environmental message that comes out loud and clear in this area. There's even a term for it that has been used repeatedly called the overview effect. When you see the world from a new level, it changes your perspective on that. And I would contend that there's a reverence associated with that borders on religion. I could go on and on about these sorts of things, but I think very much it's present in that context.
Great. Let's see. Matthew Homan asked, says you've talked much about the Soviet-Russian space program and religion. Can you take a moment to address the nascent, I'm not sure how nascent it is, Chinese program, and the to what degree, if any, is religion involved there? Or perhaps how does the emergence of China as a major player in space change the sort of historical calculus that you've both been discussing?
Well, I mean, I can talk to that at some level. I don't know specifically about the rituals that are engaged in by taikonauts as they fly in space, although I would suspect that they are present at some level, just as they would be in any other setting. A third nation moving into the ability to launch and operate in space with humans is a significant change, obviously. And the Chinese achieved that in 2003 with the launch of their first orbital vehicles. But thus far, they are operating pretty much alone in this context. They would like to make international deals to do more things along these lines, and that probably will happen over time. But they're pretty close hold in terms of the major activities that are underway for them. And I can't speak a lot about it. I'm certainly no expert, and I do not read the language.
Victoria, do you have any thoughts to share on this?
I'm afraid I don't. I don't know enough about the inner life of the Chinese space program to speak to something like religion, and I just would hate to, speculate on that. Yeah.
Sure.
On the issue of environmental stewardship, Tyler Schimpf is asking, what are your personal views on how much value should be placed on the environments of planets that would be inhospitable for human colonization? Do you believe these planets could be used for natural resources, or should we preserve those environments? In the contexts that you're each familiar with, what tends to be the teaching about how how other planetary bodies ought to be treated?
I'm happy to speak a little bit about this because of the Soviet relationship with Venus, I think in particular. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of the Soviet history of space, which is not really commonly discussed, which is the disillusionment that resulted from the Soviet discovery that Venus was not inhabitable. And up until that moment, there was real hope and I think to some degree even faith that in that when they, the Soviet side, made it to Venus, what they would discover there would be something like a young Earth, an environment that was habitable for humankind. And so there was tremendous value placed on it. And, I've read in archives and memoirs, the responses when that among even the people within the space program itself, when everyone was celebrating, oh, we made it to Venus, and then one person who's prominent in the space program says, what are we celebrating? We just found out that we're completely alone. Like, this is we everything we had hoped to find there is not there, and everything is terrible. So it does seem to me, at least historically, and I don't know that I think this probably is shifting in the kind of neoliberal late capitalist environment, but I think the human habitability was really the question of how much value was placed in other bodies. I don't know, again, this is just kind of beyond my area of expertise, but at that point, it really was a question of, can we move there? Can we live there? Can we meet somebody, some other entity there? And when the answer seemed to be that, given our technological capacity right now and for the foreseeable future, no, that was a huge moment of disillusionment. And I really think it took the wind out of the sails of a lot of that kind of early enthusiasm for expansion and exploration. So in terms of the resources, I'll pass it to MJ or Roger, because MJ, this was something you covered in your book in such a great way. But I think the human really does remain at the center of it. And I think Musk's kind of emphasis on the colonization of Mars over pretty much all of his other projects is evidence that it's really, we as humans are really primarily interested in what we might do there, right?
Yeah. Roger?
Yeah, if I could weigh in. So, and there are some concerns, and there are those at NASA who are very much focused on maintaining the pristine nature of whatever body is out there that we might visit. And so there's concern about what they refer to as forward contamination, us sending a spacecraft there, taking microorganisms of whatever type that might find a home in that particular environment and changing it in some particular way is of concern. But that's a minority, I think, of most people in terms of thinking about this. We really do think of these bodies as something that we can exploit in various kinds of ways. And that's always been the case with I'm a historian, so I focus on what does the past tell us about these things. And in terms of exploration and settlement terrestrially on this particular planet, there's always been this context of exploitation of whatever these new lands might be. And without that exploitation, there's not a sustained nature to try to go there and do very much with it. And so periodically, actually on a regular basis, I might add, it just pops up. Can we mine asteroids? Can we mine the moon? Can we extract resources from, name the solar system body of your choice, and that would be useful to us? And there's not a lot of people who say we shouldn't do that. There are some, but it's certainly a minority voice. Now, currently, there is a moon treaty that's in place, which the United States is not a signatory to, that says that the moon should be kept pristine, and that there shouldn't be those kinds of activities there. We will see what happens in the context of us finding something there we want. I mean, I constantly explain this to people, when they ask the question, why did we stop going to the moon in 1972? And the answer to that's real simple. We didn't find anything there we wanted. And the geopolitical purposes for which the Apollo program was created had been satisfied. All bets are off if we find something And you can bet there'll be a beeline by all kinds of entities, probably some of them corporate, trying to exploit those resources. And we'll see what happens. But the Moon Treaty tries to hold it pristine. I'd be surprised if they'll be successful if they find a lot of resources there. We'll see what happens.
Great, thank you for that. So here's a question from Julie Gardner. What is the relationship between religion, space, and the potential discovery of extraterrestrial life for other religious denominations? Are there denominations for which the discovery of extraterrestrial life is seen as opposed to religious beliefs? And does that affect religious attitudes towards space exploration?
Oh my.
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
That's a great question, and I can only address part of it. But I mean, I think one of the things, should we find extraterrestrial life that we can communicate with? And that's the key component here. You know, anybody who does life sciences on this planet will tell you that the vast majority of the organisms that exist here, we do not communicate with. They're microorganisms or something else that we cannot engage with in any way, shape, or form. There are obviously some animals that we can, no plants that we can talk. Well, I guess we can talk to them, but they don't talk back. And so in that context, should we find that entity out there, I can guarantee you that there will be many, many, many religious groups who will say it is our objective to bring them to the truth of whatever religious belief that they represent. And they will be there. We've also seen this in terrestrial exploration as religious officials accompanied, in some cases they even preceded the explorers themselves, and engaging in missionary work with the inhabitants of whatever new lands were there. I'm sure we would see the same thing in space. There's science fiction built around this, and I could point you to numerous books in which this has been a topic of interest with lots of interesting permutations, but we'll do that another time. Victoria, do you have anything to add? I'm sure you do.
No, I mean, I was going to also kind of punt this to science fiction because I think that that's the area where these possibilities are worked through. I don't think I have the theological breadth to say, well, here are, all of the denominations and confessions of the world, and here's how they think about space and extraterrestrial life. I think that what I've encountered theologically has been really more questions of what will humans do if they live off planet, right? What does it mean to be a Jewish person observing rituals on Mars? What does it mean to pray to Mecca on the ISS? So it's less about, it doesn't, at least not in my circles, extraterrestrial encounters have not been the kind of in the foreground of the conversation about religion, but more about what would it mean for humanity what would it mean to be a practicing member of a community, of a religious community, in another environment, on another planet. But I mean, of course there's Scientology, and there are many worlds that would speak to this, but I don't think that I could do justice to the complexity of that theology.
Well, I have good news, which is that we are going to be exploring a lot of these questions in 2 weeks' time. We are going to have scholars and religious leaders from 5 distinct traditions who are going to turn over these questions of 6 distinct traditions. We got 6 now?
We have 6 folks, I think.
Amazing. Who are going to be turning over some of these questions of our behavior, our conduct in outer space, whether religious or ethical or ecological, all of these things we're gonna get at their areas of expertise there. So thank you so much to our questioners.
Yeah, so I think that's all the time we have for today. Our thanks to our distinguished guests, Roger Launius, Victoria Smolkin, and our sincere thanks to all of you for joining us. We hope you'll attend our next session on March 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be talking, as MJ said, with representatives from several religions to discuss the question, how do religious traditions teach us to conduct ourselves in space, including conduct ourselves in relation to any life we find out there. So please share this news, the news of this series, with your friends and networks. And until next time, we bid you all peace and wonder. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Dane, take us out.